Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Carlson. I'm Dean of the Rosary College of Arts and Sciences here at Dominican University, and it is my honor to welcome you to the 8th annual Lund-Gill Lecture, featuring this year our own wild Irish rose. At Dominican University, our vision for undergraduate education is one in which students, steeped in a Dominican ethos, pursue liberal learning through foundations, breadth, depth, and integration for responsible global citizenship. We hope that our students, upon graduation, will possess knowledge, character, and skills to take informed, ethical action in the world and to influence others for the good. This includes serious attention to cultural knowledge, in which students engage and understand with empathy a diverse contemporary America and the world. I think this evening is a wonderful advancement of and expression of this vision, and I'm so glad that so many of you are here to participate. The Lund-Gill Chair is named for former Dominican University President Sister Candida Lund, and the auditorium we're in is named after Sister Candida Lund as well, and former English professor Sister Cyril Gill. Each year, the Lund-Gill Chair in the Rosary College of Arts and Sciences brings to campus an individual of the highest moral and intellectual reputation who can address themes and issues at the heart of the liberal arts and sciences. The chair teaches a course in our undergraduate honors program, which invites highly motivated, high-achieving students to challenge themselves through 4 years of special honors seminars and other honors courses. Past chair holders are listed in your program. I want especially to thank 2 of my faculty colleagues who have done so much to make this evening, and indeed this whole semester with Dr. Rose, possible. The first is Dr. Janice Monti, Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Department of Sociology and Criminology. Janice, are you out there somewhere? Thank you. And the second is Dr. Gilmer Cook, Assistant Professor of English. And I would like now to invite Gil to come forward in order to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Tricia Rose. Thank you so much and enjoy the evening.
No big deal, y'all, no big deal, no big deal. It's just a tie, don't worry about it. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you all here. Jeff did a great job of setting up the context for the Lund-Gill Chair that we're also familiar with, and with the ideologies of the Dominican mission that sort of are at the root of it. So when Jeff originally came to Janice and I about potential people to invite to be Lund-Gill Chair this semester, it was Janice who actually first said the name Tricia Rose, I believe. Am I correct in that? I do believe I'm correct in that. And then I went and constructed an email that we sent out to Tricia Rose that she then graced us with the honor of accepting our invitation to come and be the Lund-Gill Chair. So I'll just say, I just wanted to make that point just because this night has been the work of collaborative effort. You know what I mean? There's a lot of collaborative effort that's going on, collaborative effort. I have a PhD in English, you have to give me a second. I don't always speak so well. And I mean, Tricia Rose, I'll just tell you why Tricia Rose speaks to me so personally. Tricia Rose wrote this book in 1994 called Black Noise. That was the first sort of serious scholarship about hip hop. Now, I was born in 1980, right? And I grew up in New York City in the Bronx as a hip hop head. Like my generation, we are hip hop heads. And what hip hop heads means is that hip hop isn't just sonically, musically appealing to us. Like hip hop is a cultural representation of everything that represented us growing up in those New York urban centers, or the hoods, as they might sometimes get called. So the music for us, like when we analyze lyrics the way some people at some time might have analyzed a Bach composition. You know what I mean? Like we analyze hip hop the way another generation might analyze Bob Dylan lyrics. You know, we analyze hip hop the way another generation might analyze. Who are our young generation in here right now? Some nonsense that y'all care about that's garbage. I'm just kidding, excuse me, hold on. All my students always make fun of how much I sweat when I talk. Leave me alone. Right? And that's the thing, like I consider myself a hip hop scholar, right? Like, I write about hip hop in a context and in a way that speaks to its larger reach, sort of cultural reach. We're talking about literary reach, just the way rhyme is used, the way form is used, the way verse is used, the way intonation is used, everything. Like, hip hop to me is a serious academic discourse. And Tricia Rose is really one of the founding scholars that made it okay to be academically serious about hip hop as a cultural art form, as an academic pursuit. So the opportunity to have her here tonight represents so much for me personally, and I think for this campus in general, and I just think it's great that she's here. And I just want everybody to just please join me in clapping so loud. No, I'm just kidding. Please, let's welcome Tricia Rose. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Goodness. Thank you very much. That was more than an intro. It was a warm-up act. Which is good. We all need people to help us at that level all the time. How are we doing tonight? We're good? Wow, there's so many of you. It's pretty exciting. You know, every day I come here, every Monday when I come, I pretty much get dropped off. I think it's over there, and I walk right by here, and I think, I wonder what that theater's like when people are in it and people are on stage. And here it is. Voila. I've been gifted. Okay, so before we get started, I got to do a little tech here. All right, is this okay? Got to do a little test. Is this okay? Oh, good, because I'm not a keep stiller. I'm a move arounder, and I wanted to know if I was going to lose you before I did. Okay, before I get started, I must thank everyone who's been involved in making this visit here this semester really rather terrific. I first want to start with Gil, who did reach out and write a very kind email and has been super kind ever since, and really, you know, understands my work, and I always just deeply appreciate that. Janice Monte's been amazing. We're vowing to start some trouble at the Blues Symposium. Where is she? There she is. And we're planning that now. If you see us having lunch, let us be. We're in deep training for the session. She's been wonderful. Of course, Dean Carlson's been wonderful. I mean, just really terrific from the beginning, answering every crazy question, doing things deans are not supposed to have to do, like send calendar dates, just everything from the smallest to the biggest. And of course, I want to thank President Carroll for having a reception, for allowing me to have this opportunity, and to really creating a great space. I was really taken aback by the very sort of specific cultural sense that Dominican students have. You know, I've taught in a lot of places. I've been at Brown for a minute, that's true, about 8 years, but I've taught at Santa Cruz, I've taught at NYU for many years, and then tiny stints at places like Wesleyan when I was visiting for a little while, and you know, Yale, which is also my undergraduate alma mater. And you know, I'm just really taken by the culture of care among the students that Dominican has. I mean, students are wonderful to each other everywhere in some numbers, but I think there's a sort of underlying ethos of care. And I actually think how we care about each other is much more important to who we're going to be than a specific set of data or a specific set of information. So I just want to thank you all for allowing me to be part of this kind of community, but also thank you for creating it. And I'm just, as an outsider, wanted to let you know what you have so that you don't take it for granted. Oh, you're welcome. So this talk requires a pre-talk. So I'm looking at the clock. I've brought my phone with my dog on it, just, you know, for time's sake. 6:12. Okay. It has a little pre-talk, and the talk will make a lot more sense with a pre-talk. So here's the pre-talk. Now, I've been thinking about Black culture and Black popular culture and questions of race and the role of culture in society, whether or not cultural expressive forms can play a role in shifting people's consciousness or creating community or reducing community or being exhilarating or helping people transcend structural problems or encouraging structural problems for more than 20 years. And this didn't really begin with hip hop, but that's really what I have been historically most well known for, is sort of studying those questions in relation to hip hop. But my bigger set of questions has to do with what I just began with. How does the creative space that we generate relate to and both reflect the conditions under which we live, but also create new conditions for us to imagine? It's that dialectical tension between the ways in which who we are is a reflection of things we sometimes cannot control, and the ways in which what we create can also imagine things we are not yet in existence. And that tension's very important to me, for both good reasons and bad reasons. That is to say, sometimes we can dig ourselves a terrible hole, a terrible future hole with that kind of energy, or we can imagine our ways outside of it. Right? Blues is a fabulous tradition for some of this complexity, which is sort of how do you manage the utter irrationality of enslavement and Jim Crow life? How do you sort of make sense of it without falling into a hole and giving up, right? Because you gotta have to make sense. How do you go on with it? So there's this whole tension in the blues all the time, it seems to me, about how people are acknowledging the irrational insanity and overwhelming nature of the impossibility of their lives, and they're commenting on it in such a way at the same time as to make it more livable and to, in a sense, create a consciousness that is not consumed by that suffering, a consciousness that's not within it. So the simple and incredibly one-dimensional blues phrase, which I'm hoping some of you have heard in your life, and if you hadn't, I'm sure Dr. Monty will repeat it for you at some point, is, if it wasn't for bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. But just think about that for a second. You don't have luck when you have bad luck, but then like, well, wait a minute, that is a form of luck, which means now luck itself is not just good luck. Luck is good luck, bad luck, and neutral luck. So now we have a trajectory where you can actually enact some change, because luck isn't just good luck, but it's also hilarious, right? If it wasn't for bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. Like, that's the luck of your draw. So here you have this very simple idea that's constantly reformulated in the blues that speaks to a way of being under duress. Okay, so that's an example of what interests me generally. Now, hip-hop struck me as this rather extraordinary post-civil rights era, miraculous effort to make something out of very, very little, using this kind of historical cultural tradition where you narrate the impossible through stories of possibility, where you take the sort of urban fragments of what would historically have been considered chitlins, right, the leftovers, the lack of resources, and turn them into something creative, right? But of course, that process is fraught with the reality of the conditions and circumstances. And as I began to pay closer and closer attention to what happens to hip hop as it emerges and then as it transforms itself, I realized that the historical traditions that have shaped most of what African American culture has turned into have shifted dramatically in the past 40 years or so. And that the very things that we've been excited about, ending Jim Crow, making voter discrimination illegal, making equality and equal access a requirement by law, et cetera. These are things, ending school segregation as a legal mandate. These are all remarkable achievements given our nation's history on these questions in particular, and given the resistance to them, something we like to forget about. Those are remarkable achievements. But in the very era of those achievements, a whole new kind of ideological formation developed that I'm not sure we have the sort of muscle memory for figuring out how to solve. And that's what's been sort of at the heart of my confusion. It put in short, it's sort of like this. How do you define and grow and develop Black culture in a society obsessed with the idea that they cannot see race? You get the problem? Okay. So we've become a colorblind nation, supposedly, in the spirit of racial equality, and I'm going to unpack why that's impossible, but that's a little later in the actual talk, still kind of in the pre-talk, moving into the talk. How do you find and define black culture in a society that is both colorblind, as I say in the title of the talk, Colorblind Nation, Black Cultural Debates in a Colorblind Nation, but also that is obsessed with consuming black culture? So you have a society that says, I don't see race or color when it comes to questions of discrimination, but are completely color struck when it comes to consuming culture. So that black popular culture takes up a disproportionate amount of space in American society. I mean, look, I love African American music and style and creativity, so it's certainly not problematic for me to constantly turn on the TV and find people of African descent doing something very creative. That's terrific for me as a scholar. It's wonderful, but it's quite disproportionate. Should we remind you, African Americans barely make up 12% of the population. And in the question of expressive culture, in the mainstream, it is far more present than any number of other groups of people who make up a much greater percentage, or equal numbers. So what accounts for this? And more importantly, what accounts for what kind of images we consume? And as my fabulous honor seminar students and I continue to debate, what makes certain images resonate as black, and therefore to what degree does that make them more desirable as black? And how does that fit into a nation that spends all its time telling us they don't see color? This is kind of a blues conundrum. This is kind of like, it's kind of like if I didn't have any bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. So this began to I began to get obsessed around this because when I began working on hip hop, it was an underground, irrelevant form that nobody thought was going to go anywhere. In fact, when I was in graduate school, which was tragically, I think Gil might have been in the first grade. And for those of you in my age group, you know just how devastating that kind of information is. When in your heart you're still 26, you're like, what's up with this ever-increasing decade-like numerical transformation? That's a theoretical word for aging. Anyway, but the point is, I went to grad school, and they said, look, you can't write on this. It's going to be gone in 3 years. You'll never get a job. I swear, that's not even a joke. They said, look, it was 1986, 1987, and they said, look, we just don't want you to, be unemployed. You got to write on something that exists. I said, I think this one's going to last. What did I know? But what I decided, this is an aside, but what I decided was that if I was going to do that, if I was going to write on something I didn't love, I might as well just go to law school and get rich doing it. I figured if I'm going to be broke as an academic, I might as well have a good old time. So anyway, that's another story. So I said, no, I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to ride this horse till it looks like it's not going anywhere. But what that meant was that I started paying attention to the early formations of hip hop, and those early formations had everything to do with trying to sustain and transform a set of traditions around sound and rhythm and call and response and dance and creativity, and using resources at your disposal that are often haphazard to tell stories of lived experience, to respond to the tragic comic confusion of urban America in the post-industrial era. What did it mean to be black in 1976, 77, 78, when deindustrialization guts working class, low entry-level access jobs for people of color, just guts it. Several cities, what you see in Detroit now, if you've been following the news, is really just a logical extension of what began in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so that context means that I never really thought about what would happen when hip-hop went to this level of the mainstream and what kinds of contexts it would be in. And that's when these other questions started to come into existence. So what really has become central to me is trying to figure out how the spaces of black cultural expression, where they take place, have dramatically changed under the post-civil rights era, and then how have a variety of other conditions made it virtually impossible to unravel this knot of a black cultural obsession in a colorblind era. So that's been a question of mine for a little while. So I'm gonna read some of this and come off the page and read and come off the page, because otherwise I'll just talk forever and you'll leave me and it will not be pretty. So I'm gonna try to stay on it as much, and so we have enough time for Q&A. And if there is a point at which you're thoroughly confused, just holler. I'm all good with corrections midstream. So what happens in this era, this post-civil rights era, when African-American popular culture, which historically had its own institutional spaces, right? What segregation generated, for the most part, and I don't mean just the South, I also mean Chicago, I also mean New York, I also mean Baltimore, I mean Philadelphia, I mean Detroit. That was back when there were white people in Detroit. You know, it's like, when they started calling it the Chocolate City, it was not a joke, but nonetheless, that those spaces of expressive culture were related to institutions that were part of the community itself. What eventually begins to happen is those institutions begin to fall away under the impetus of integration, but what follows that is not integration, but the loss of those institutions and the lack of a sort of literacy about black culture. So this context is the moment really when hip hop begins to come of age. And I started trying to map what were the key contexts for the confusion and alliances of a colorblind nation and an obsession with black cultural imagery at this moment. So the first thing is that up until the mid-1980s, popular cultural spaces and mass cultural spaces were largely separate. Now again, I know, Gil grows up on hip hop and that's great, but the other thing that everybody older than that age grew up on was virtually no mass culture. Mass culture was TV and a couple of mainstream artists on the pop charts. There's no internet. I know, just hang on. We're going way back now. There's no internet. There's no cell phones. There's no niche marketing. There's no social networks. There's no cable TV. I'm from New York City. There are 12 million people in that city when I'm growing up, and we had 2.5 TV stations. You got the third with aluminum foil on some rabbit ears in black and white. Anybody? I mean, I'm not kidding. And TV went off. You stay up too late, it'd be shh. You'd be like, dang, what am I gonna do now? Come up with stuff to do. I think I would be terrorized today if I turned on my television and it was just going shh. I'd be like, oh, dang, we're in a war. I would be like trying to get my grit and some water. I'd be all freaked out. So what happens is mass culture goes from being about this big, controlled by a variety of small, relatively independent, smaller corporations, to becoming a massive space expanded by new technologies and the sort of assumption and consumption of popular spaces and the consolidation of that space. So it expands exponentially with cable television, internet, and mass media productivity. And it also begins to consolidate in terms of social control. Now, what that ends up doing is generating a top-down space for recognizing cultural expressions and scooping them up right away. So I'll tell you a very quick, hilarious story from, maybe not hilarious to you, it's in my crazy mind, so I'll just tell you a quick story. You can elect to decide if it's hilarious. I was watching television, this was back when MTV had like Yo MTV Raps or something. I know, it's tragic. Anyway, LL Cool J, yes, Mr. NCIS Los Angeles, before that particular gig, is in a video, deciding that in his leisure suit, he should roll one pant leg up. Did anybody remember this fashion statement? Just one leg up, with his little bony leg hanging out of a tracksuit. And I thought, man, pull your pants leg down. I'm like, man, you messed up your whole look. I was like, this is so terrible. I was like, oh man, LL's falling off. You have that moment, you're like, what happened to LL? Man, it was not, 2 weeks later, everybody in my neighborhood had one pants leg rolled up. I thought I was in some kind of body snatchers. I was like, why are you, LL's the man, you know what I'm saying? We got, they just rolled it up. It's take two. Kids come out of prison, putting juveniles in adult facilities. For example, in New York State, if you're over 16, you get tried as an adult, you end up in an adult facility. 16 seems quite young to me for that. Anyway, one of the stylistic interventions from this policy, the expansion of the prison industrial complex and the reduction of age for adult incarceration, means that there are 16-year-old boys who might weigh 125 pounds soaking wet, but in this case, it's just soaking wet, have to wear adult prison gear. And to wear adult prison gear means to wear big pants. But they don't have the body for big pants, and they can't wear a belt, and they can't call their mama to sew them up. So they have to wear baggy pants, which fall down far enough to show most of their underwear, and they have to figure out how to look cool. And this is going to come back to a part of my talk. They have to figure out how to wear this oversized clothing on a vulnerable young body in such a way that it establishes a level of confidence and maybe even, if you're super lucky, intimidation. This is a remarkable feat because not only do they do it there, but when they get out, they do it outside, and within 6 months, Macy's has XXL pants, and half of y'all are wandering around with your behind hanging out with underwear that's not meant to be seen. You following me? So what's happening here? A combination of structural conditions, mass media expansion, and the industry cultivating a stylistic moment and mass producing it through clothing, through style, through television, et cetera, et cetera. These are two very quick snapshots that illuminate a dramatically changed territory, some of which is aesthetic, right, is about style, and some of which is about structural conditions, incarceration, mass communication, that create the context for understanding how this picture begins to come together. So you have this mass market context, and then you also have this obsession with color blindness, and I want to spend a little time on this because color blindness, before I start describing its history, I want to just say very quickly that I know many people believe it to be a very positive and progressive ideal, that if we want to get past racism, we have to get past seeing race. And I understand the impulse behind this from a sort of progressive intention. But it's actually not what it looks like. And in the moment that we're in, it's really working to do the very opposite thing than we meaning those of us who have the view I'm suggesting, a progressive intention. It actually has the opposite effect than we intend. And so I want to spend some time unpacking how this happened and why the way we use it is so dangerous, because it helps explain how we can live, again, in a nation that is colorblind in its ideology, but not only obsessively consumes black culture, but allows for a level of structural inequality to go mostly unaddressed. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. Now, colorblindness is a term used to define the absence or disregard of race or racial characteristics. Colorblindness, or to quote, not see color, is especially important when it relates to, in the way we talk about it, interpersonal dynamics, surveillance, say police profiling, participation in an activity, and receiving services. The premise of colorblindness, as its supporters see it, is that it ends racism because it results in a purely meritocratic society. All, in this version, are judged on the basis of merit, regardless of their color. Colorblind ideology claims to reject old-fashioned racism, and thus its adherents align themselves with what they consider the spirit of the civil rights movement. In fact, many proponents believe that colorblindness will itself end any racial discrimination and racial privilege, as race-blind activity will create a level playing field. For many proponents of a colorblind or post-race, which is the new little sister or little brother of colorblindness, post-race society, counting people by race, say on the census, or researching people along racial categories, studying black popular culture, and talking about how existing race-neutral policies reduce racial equality are part of the problem. Post-race optimists typically emphasize all the racial progress that's been made and position racism, and this is important, as merely an antiquated marginal practice, that racism is a vestige, a legacy of the past, that racism is the kind of hatred and hostility and full segregated ideology of Jim Crow, and that racism, since it's on the decline, is going to fade out on its own. And if we keep paying any attention to race or talking about it, it will actually continue. Do you guys follow me? Okay. During the mid-1980s, early important public expressions of this very logic, one that uses colorblindness against racialized efforts to end racism, were linked directly to the civil rights movement. So let me just stop you for a minute. So what I'm saying very specifically is that colorblind ideology makes the case that anything that marks race as a significant factor and asks for policies to address it generate racism. So that would be all affirmative action. That would mean studying discrimination in the job market. You'd have no grounds to do it. You couldn't make a case for racial profiling because you wouldn't have any data, because there would be no ability to address that in a colorblind, purely articulated space. So in fact, it's using colorblindness to mandate the lack of data gathering around race. So in 1986, there was a really pivotal moment during Reagan's radio address. And there was a lot of anxiety in the 1980s that 1970s policies, civil rights, post-civil rights era transition, those policies were going to generate a lot of attention and data gathering around racial inequality. And you can mark that by talking about racial categories. So there was a real investment in figuring out how to reduce that, because there was a lot of resistance, like there was for the laws that were passed in the 1960s. But in 1986, Reagan's radio address marking the first Martin Luther King Jr. holiday in honor of his memory, Reagan redeployed Martin King's oft-cited phrase this way. This is Reagan speaking. "We want a colorblind society, a society that, in the words of Dr. King, quote, judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And about a month later, Reagan explained how this would play out. We've seen that affirmative action programs, that was becoming a quota system. Now, I've lived long enough to have seen quotas, Reagan said, when they were employed in my youth as a means of discrimination. We want what I think Martin King asked for. We want a colorblind society. Now, through colorblind ideology, Reagan actually positions race-based policies that are designed to end racial discrimination as themselves being against the civil rights era programs and movement. And he's making the argument that these efforts to redress discrimination are themselves discriminatory insofar as they produce inequalities. You guys following me? This is really how we got this whole ball started. So that's why I'm giving you this context for a reason. So he basically then says, using King's words as a way to appear friendly in support of civil rights ideology, while he was in fact dramatically working to undercut all affirmative action, any policies that racially focused attempts to address inequality were a significant focused effort under Ronald Reagan, and many to come. But this common idea that somehow we will reach racial parity and social equality by not attending to the category as it relates to modes of discrimination and not figuring out any ways to address it along those lines. Now, just for those of you who don't study race at all, I'll just give you a few statistics. Colorblind ideology runs up against rather dramatic and overwhelming statistics, data, and ethnographic evidence of the existence of contemporary systemic racial inequality and discrimination in every facet of society. When I say contemporary, I mean not just legacy, not just vestiges, not just things that were from 1936 that are somehow sort of just petering out and we're almost done, but new forms that continue to be entrenched in the present tense that therefore produce a future. So let me give you a few examples. Obviously in housing, education, health, wealth rates, rates of incarceration, unemployment, police brutality, etc. A few specifics. Blacks are 3 times more likely to be poor than whites. They earn 40% less than whites overall. They have about 1/8 of the net worth that whites have. And actually, during the recession, that net worth gap went 20-1 during the housing crisis, because the depletion of the value of property for African Americans who owned any property was dramatically significant, much higher loss of value, even though the market could be the same in that given city. So there was a kind of disproportionate effect of the housing crisis. In general, even when that crisis was not going on, Black-owned property, when it's similar in size and shape, is valued at 35% less on average than other racial groups, and they have much less access to the housing market. And then there were things like, subprime lending, which was largely poor minority communities were targeted for subprime lending, even when they did not, in fact, qualify for high interest rate loans. Even if they qualified for better interest rate loans, they were steered to this. Wells Fargo has admitted this, other banks have admitted this, so this is not like some conspiracy theory I'm coming up with, but when you accumulate it, it's rather remarkable. Black people pay more for goods and services across neighborhoods, obviously due to segregation, that's easy to achieve. They die earlier from stress-related illnesses, and all kinds of studies around public space behavior in treatments and stores and restaurants, et cetera. So there's a deluge of evidence, and I'm just really tapping the surface. The educational inequalities are profound. The tax-based resources for public education based on race are profound. But the deluge of evidence that deep racial inequalities exist today tells us not only about the legacies and their impact, but current policies. And so we're left with this haunting question. What do we make of this data? How do we account for this in a post-race, colorblind society that trumpets race-neutral policy and behavior? Who is responsible for this state of affairs, since nobody seems to be in favor of it, right? And there's a great, a remarkable study on this, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Edward Bonilla Silva and his research, but there's a huge gap. Everyone, if you randomly survey people, I can't remember the name of the study right now. It's going to come to me, and I'll let you know. I'm tracking the database right now. The study basically asks people, do they believe in racial equality, et cetera, or gender equality, whatever kind of equality. It's a general study. And 98% of people will say yes, 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 across all racial groups. When you ask different groups of people whether or not that if there were not inequality, would they want policies to help fix it, most other groups say yes, except for whites, who say no. That basically, although they believe in equality, any policy that ends the current status of their freedom is not acceptable. And that number is about 75% of a rejection rate. And this becomes really particularly important in marking how what scholars are calling the new racism operates. In other words, it does not operate the way it did before, and therefore it's much harder to understand and to hold on to. So without going into too much length and distance here, let me just quickly move through what a number of sociologists have started talking about as the new racism. Patricia Williams, Patricia Hill Collins, Bonilla Silva, and a variety of others have been trying to sort of frame this post-civil rights era in a way that makes it more comprehensible. Like, what kind of era are we in? So there were four major characteristics, and the fourth one is what I want us to talk about. But I'm going to skim through the others just so you know where we are. One is abstract liberalism. That's what I just described. I'm for equality, but I'm against affirmative action, right? So I'm for equal opportunity, but that also means that if there is inequality, if my opportunity is reduced, so be it if it's more than equal, I'm not giving it up. So this abstract liberalism trumps the ability to actually make a change on the ground. Number two is the naturalization of matters that reflect racialized privilege. So that, instead of saying, well, here's why there's segregation or here's discrimination in the job market or people's behavior, they basically neutralize privilege into personal choice. Well, I just wanted to live near my cousin, or I wanted to, they sort of personalize what is a set of structural constraints. Third is minimization. Yes, there's racism out here, but, it's mostly in the past, and there are plenty of jobs out there, and, there's a lot of political figures who run on campaigns like that, sort of minimization. The fourth is what I want to talk about because it relates to the popular cultural arena, and that's cultural racism. That is to say that Black urban culture in particular gets constructed as itself dysfunctional and problematic, crime-ridden, familially, fragile, rife for purporting to propel behaviors that create problems. And so black culture becomes understood as basically dysfunctional. And this approach really gets us at the heart of why we're having so much trouble with the black culture that we're consuming and the denial of color blindness, because this is where we're coming back to. So the approach of cultural racism basically makes an argument that black people are disproportionately poor. They're segregated into these very troubled neighborhoods, largely because of their cultural behavior. And the cultural behavior is what generates the conditions around them. So it's a reversal of actually how the situation comes into being, but it serves to normalize and justify the status quo. That is to say that all the programs in the world won't fix it. Why? Because they're not structural conditions, they're cultural conditions, they're behavioral conditions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how this plays itself out in a couple of minutes. But what does this have to do with black culture? Why and how has this colorblind interpretive framework with these 4 key features and what some scholars call the new racism, how has it impacted the questions of black cultural debate and perception? Now, this cultural racism one holds some important answers for us here, because it perceives African American culture, and frankly culture itself, no matter whose it is, as a fixed, independent feature of social structures. And it uses this independent idea to rationalize racial, in this case, racial inequality. And this is a generative place to think through my broader questions. So, when you think about, say, the blues, it has aesthetic traditions that don't have entirely to do with structures, but it has everything to do with structures in the way the music moves, how it comes into being, and even the logic of, if it weren't for bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. That doesn't make any sense unless you have some conceptual historical relationship to the conditions of people of African descent. So in this new formation, though, with cultural racism, basically culture is fixed and independent of social structures. It creates its own circumstances and conditions. So cultural racism in the post-civil rights era is the only one of these 4 that specifically focuses on black people and how they're behaving and perceived. And this facet of colorblind ideology is important because it reveals the connections between racialized inequality and white privilege and the definitions of black culture itself. So how we define black culture, what makes it actually black in our consuming patterns, has everything to do with our perception of what constitutes black people's everyday life and what they would do on their own, regardless of the conditions they're in. You following me? So you can see where this, maybe not, but you can see where, hopefully you can see where this is going to go in a minute. We're getting there, but I had to set this up for you. We're really getting there. I swear I can check. I'm checking. I swear. Okay. Now, the black culture as dysfunction argument is not a right-wing or left-wing, frankly, ideology. It transcends racial ascription. You have lots of middle-class black people who say this. Obama himself, who's clearly a liberal, not part of the right wing, they spend their whole day trying to attack that brother. I'm like, don't you want to represent your district? I'm like, gosh, you're so busy. Anyway, and I don't even really love Obama. I'm just saying, let's just work this out. We got a lot of things to do. Chop, chop. Nation needs us. Anyway, Obama spends his time sometimes chastising black communities more than any other group of people in the country, I might add, talking about take your slippers off and put on your marching shoes, as if black people are wearing slippers just doing nothing all day. Like, slippers? I take mine off on my way to work right before I leave the door every day. What are you referring to? There's this kind of stop, being lazy and read to your children. Well, why is it black people should be targeted to read to their children? Shouldn't we all read to our children? Why do you only tell black people to read to their children? You see what I'm getting at? There's a whole, and I could be here for hours about the ways in which liberals and conservatives participate in an easy, normalized language that makes this case that it is black culture itself that's in black people's way. Now, I want specifically to sort of play this out. I'm going to move ahead because I just think it's a good idea. This plays itself out in a very complicated way between social structure and aesthetics. And again, this is what really interests me, because I ask people, you know, even my own students in my class here, sort of what makes, you know, hip-hop style black to you? What is it? Is it the sagging pants? Like, what is it? What do you know? And most people, everywhere I go, all of my classes, anywhere I've ever taught, and any other media context or public lecture context, people really don't have an answer to that. It's a tautological response, which is, well, black people are doing it, so it must be black, because black people are doing it, and therefore it's black, and black people are doing it, and that doesn't quite work. Obviously, there's got to be something more at stake, because if I broke into an aria right now, you would not decide that opera was black. Right, so there must be something else besides just being black. I mean, you know, I studied opera, so I know it's really not black. It's great. I love opera, but it's not black. Okay. It could be in the future, but it's not right now. So what ends up happening is that the connection between structure and aesthetics creates an enormous confusion and connects the consumption of blackness to the purported dysfunction of blackness. So let me give you two examples. The first example is called cool versus the cool pose. Now, the idea of cool and the so-called cool pose are casualties of this collision between the obsession with the consumption of black style and the association of blackness with dysfunctionality and problematic behavior. So coolness there's a lot of interesting aesthetic studies on the idea of the cool, about presenting oneself in a way that is nonplussed, that is not stressed by one's environment, even when one is under enormous duress, and the ways in which one responds indirectly with a level of remove and implacability at the same time. There's a lot of theoretical work on how this particular style has moved around the diaspora and found homes all over the world, and claimed, you know, it's been sort of at the hallmark and at the hub of artistic movements from a variety of places, and actually has been a conceptual benchmark for artistic value. One scholar says, cool is the silent and knowing rejection of marginality, a self-dignified expression of masculinity, she argues, although other people say it's cross-gender, developed by black men denied certain expressions of manhood. Now, in educational culture and scholarship, there's a massive debate over the cool pose. That the cool pose, many scholars of education have argued, and people observing education, have argued that, in fact, the cool pose is the source of black male underachievement in education. That if they didn't act so doggone cool, maybe they'd study more and be invested, and then, in fact, they would do better, and then they'd go to school, and then they'd go to college, and then fill in the blank, I guess racism would end. So Majors and Bilson address what they term the cool pose in their study and argue that it helps black men counter stress caused by social oppression and racism, and that, you know, it provides them with a sense of control, confidence, stability, and to manage the rejections and negative messages that are normally portrayed. Despite these cultural, contextual, and aesthetic contextualizations of cool and the cool pose, the notion of cool pose has become publicly considered the key origin, as I said, of the black male achievement gap, and the umbrella term for a set of street-orientated practices that stymie success. William Julius Wilson, probably the most famous black sociologist in the world at Harvard, makes this argument, quote, cool pose is about making sexual conquests, hanging out on the street after school, taking party drugs, and listening to hip-hop music. In this reworking, the cool pose is no longer a cultural approach to bodies moving in time and space, and which can define a wide range of behaviors and actions. For example, Miles Davis is a quintessential physical embodiment in his performances of managing the cool and making it, playing on the edges. And some people say he went too far when he performed with his, butt to the audience. That's how cool he was. He didn't have to look at you. I'm like, that's a little too cool for me. But anyway. So cool has its boundaries, but nonetheless, in this reworking, cool pose is no longer a cultural approach that can define a wide range of behaviors and actions. It's no longer a style. It's not a way of moving in space. It's a coherently defined set of negative, derogatory behaviors and characteristics. So cool is now pressed into dysfunctional articulation, and we get a collapse between aesthetics and the politics of dysfunctionality. This may seem like a small matter, but it's really not. It explains a lot of how we've gotten very confused about what makes something black and what doesn't, and what are the structural conditions that generate certain types of behaviors and approaches. Another major sociologist makes the similar argument in an op-ed piece. So why were they flunking out, talking about the attrition rate of African American men? Their candid answer was what sociologists call the cool pose culture of young black men who were simply too gratifying to give up. For these young men, it was almost like a drug, hanging out on the streets after school and shopping and dressing sharply and sexual conquests and party drugs. I've never heard of, what's a non-party drug? What, do you just take drugs when you're alone? It's not a party? I don't understand party drugs, but that's another discussion. Party drugs, hip-hop music and culture, and the fact that almost all superstar athletes and a great many of the nation's best entertainers were black. This makes sense to people because the full collapse between the style and the conditions of sort of social behavior that one might find not as advancing of educational opportunities are totally collapsed. But more important, all high school kids are about music, hanging out after school, dressing sharply, and doing whatever the drugs of the era are, even in the 1950s. It was cigarettes, I know, but it was true. Cigarettes and alcohol. I mean, what young people don't do that? But in this context, it's so nefarious and so troubling and so, oh yes, if these black kids would just stop with the partying and hanging out and trying to ogle girls, which many heterosexual boys apparently do at 14, 15, 16, 17, 25, 40, 75. You know, it astonishes me, the lack of self-awareness that this kind of analysis takes up. Now, I'm not suggesting that there are not unique challenges and that there are not perhaps behavioral adjustments that communities that are marginalized should make to do better in their various institutions. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying, hey, it's all good. What I am saying, though, is that the conversation that we're having begins on an assumption that the culture of black people are in their way, and therefore, one, they have to get out of their own way. Two, we can tell them what's good, bad, or indifferent. And three, that we're not responsible for the conditions that they find themselves in. And then we have black-focused colorblind racism working very coherently without much challenge. The second one I'm not going to spend too much time on, but it's the keeping it real phenomenon. And I'm mostly interested here in the way it has become again, collapsing a kind of prophetic tradition with a kind of self-destructive trajectory. So keeping it real is a very contradictory contemporary term that revises and speaks to two central ideas in black culture and history. One is the idea of trying to sustain one's cultural identity under so much pressure. So this idea of authenticity, which has certainly been properly rejected as a legitimate term. There's no like one way to be black or brown or yellow or green or whatever color we are, although we're all green today, I understand. There's not one way to be black in this context, but so the notion of authenticity has been rejected rightfully. But the principle that one needs to kind of protect one's own self-definition under duress is a very important principle that remains. So how do you avoid the sort of assimilationist against your own culture tradition? It is a piece of the keeping it real phenomenon. The second is the prophetic black tradition, which celebrates challenges to power through truth-telling. The oratory spirit of saying, I'm going to keep it real. I'm going to say what I know is true right now, even though it'd probably be cheaper and better for me to keep quiet, right? That it would be beneficial to me, but I feel a need to speak this particular truth about the condition. That impulse generates internal critique of society at large because it valorizes challenges to authority and educates the community around itself through that moment of speaking truth to power. Now, in the context of what happens to hip-hop in the commercial arena, I'll say that one more time because it's really important. In the commercial arena, not all of hip-hop done everywhere in every way, but commercial hip-hop, the notion of keeping it real is pressed into service of pathologizing so-called cultural traditions and practices. So keeping it real is not speaking truth to power. I don't know when was the last time you heard some kind of anti-racist rhetoric in commercial mainstream hip-hop, but feel free to send me a note when you find it. when anyone says anything about poverty or anything about mass incarceration in mainstream commercial hip hop in any meaningful way, not a catchphrase inside a song that's otherwise about a Maybach. Just as a point of clarification. What happens? Keeping it real in commercial hip hop becomes synonymous with a particular set of what we associate with black ghetto excessive behaviors and also destructive behaviors, and then being truthful about it. So I'm keeping it real about all the self-destructive behaviors I've been involved in inside of commercial mainstream hip hop. And this is really another example of valorizing in the mainstream, like the cool pose, taking a tradition, a cultural aesthetic process, pressing it into service to serve a set of images and representations in the mainstream society. So the autobiographical drive of hip hop elevates this idea of keeping it real, and the incredible commercial power of the storytelling based only on ghettoized street cultural narrative drives what we understand keeping it real to be today. Now, in my work on hip hop in the last 10 years, the book that came out a few years ago, not Black Noise that Gil was so kind to reference, but Hip Hop Wars, really speaks to this moment. And I want to just take a couple seconds on this, which is that the richness of hip hop as mass cultural media expanded dramatically. Remember that part of the talk many minutes ago when we were talking about the expansion of mass media? At the same time as all of these outlets emerge, it happens right around the time hip hop becomes sort of mainstream, the images in hip hop contract dramatically. So about 10 years ago, for example, let me come to that in a minute. The images contract dramatically. So what you have is a set of very limited tropes about African Americans that hip hop expresses. If you go back to, say, 1985 to 1996, 97, even as much as 98, you have a much wider range of types of rhymes, different types of stories, different types of experiences. Some of them were gangster, some of them were thug life, some of them were about, dreamscapes, some of them were, about, possible fantasy. You had groups like De La Soul, like, it would be laughable to imagine them on the radio today, right? So you have this wide range of storytelling that uses the hip hop form as a way to articulate a generational set of youthful experiences. Again, some are street, some are not. Some are about school, some are about something else. So, really, a wide range. As hip hop gets more and more commercially mainstream and more information is gleaned about who's consuming hip hop, and they discover, which I was just telling my class today, with the SoundScan intervention, they discover that mostly high school white suburban males are consuming gangster rap and making it go to the charts at the top of the charts, #1. NWA debuts on #1 pop charts, not black charts, pop charts, with Elfin Verzagen. Why? Because gangster rap was much more interesting to suburban whites. So what do? They say, well, this is what the big audience wants, because remember, black people are 12%. We're going to go gangster. And I've interviewed many executives in this era. Right at this time, I was writing my first book on this, and they basically said, look, you don't know how many albums were scrapped. Albums were about to come out, and when they realized just how much more profitable the gangster trope is, everybody had to go back and do gun songs. It's like, do a gun song. Here's your key to the studio. Chop, chop, we need a new record. It's just completely, I'll be very specific. The woman who was head president of Def Jam and Rush Communications was very clear that whole albums were scrapped and new albums had to be released because they felt the profit margin would be much greater if the narratives were much more focused on gangster rap. So what happens? The images start to contract. And what do they contract around? Another combination of structure turned into culture. The street culture of commercial hip hop, which I call in Hip Hop Wars, the gangster pimp ho trinity. That's what it is. It's a religion. I know I'm at a school with important religious beliefs. It's not officially a religion, but the level of emotional investment and serious belief that it is the only way to articulate truthfulness, authenticity, and realness in hip hop, that's the Trinity. What are those three professions? Those three professions are the result of 50–60% unemployment, disrespect of women in general, and the street trade for women is the sex trade, and the drug trade, and the criminal project of mass incarceration that sort of both produces and flows from these conditions simultaneously. So the gangster pimpo Trinity becomes authentic blackness. Not the artistic creativity of the story being told, but the content of the story being told. So African American artists have to perform this kind of blackness. If they don't, they're not actually black. They're not authentic. They don't count. They're like doing something else. Not aesthetic complexity. See, I'm not saying that because I was just, again, telling my class today, I warned them, I said, you guys are getting me into hip hop. You're going to ruin my lecture. I'm going to have to say it twice. But Lil Wayne, for example, is a great example of this to me. There's many examples, but Rick Ross is another example. This is not an aesthetically high-end form of poetic construction. There's no aesthetic, significance to his rhymes that I've been able to discern. On the other hand, Lil Wayne is incredibly gifted. If his metaphors were about something other than the Trinity, we'd be fall down dead, like just drooling over his work. It would be amazing. It's actually still darn good, despite, I'm like, really, another word for that? Really? I'm like, do I need another set of index cards? I'm like, is this still an insult for women? Or what? Or are we talking about drugs now? Did we go over to jail? Where are we in the Trinity? I get lost in there because it just all floats around, but it's always some amazing metaphor. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that as this mass market intensifies in breadth of reach, it sends these very narrow images to the widest range of audience members all the time. Another quick example from Hip Hop Wars. I was driving cross country with my husband, which we did many times after we moved back east from California. We would drive back out there because we miss the weather. We really miss it now. Don't ask why I moved back east. I don't have a coherent answer for that, so don't ask. I love brown, but still it's too cold. Anyway, we're driving back and forth, and I keep hearing the same songs. I'd be in Nevada. I'd be in Memphis. I'd be like, well, let's find the black radio station. And everybody was KISS, and everybody was playing the same 50 songs. Didn't matter what region I was in. That was not the case 10, 15 years ago. So I said, I gotta do some homework on this. So what did I discover? Several things. One, a group called Industry Ears did, a serious study and discovered that the repetition of same songs on commercial radio went from 50 times a week to 150 times a week. So if you think the song you thought you hated on Monday is playing enough to make you like it by Friday, the answer is yes. You know full well you'd be saying the lyrics to a song you don't even like. 50 to 150 in a very short period of time. That's number one. Number two, radio stations are no longer regional outlets for expressive culture where there might be local styles, right? Go-Go from DC would never have survived in this economic market because two industries, companies own all of the black radio stations in the top 30 markets for black audiences. Two. And most of those are Clear Channel by far. So what they've begun doing is having regional programmers who are virtual. So there's like nobody in the studio in many of these places, or occasional people pop in, and they have recorded voices saying, I love so-and-so, KISS FM, hip-hop's the home of home and R&B, out, whatever. They're not there, they're somewhere else. They're playing that button, and they've predetermined what song's going to get played. It doesn't matter what the local community wants. Program directors used to have call-ins. People might be in Philly. You'd have a sound that people loved the fourth cut off the album, not the one the artist wanted to release, and that would be the song everybody wanted to hear, and you'd have a kind of organic relationship between the music, the artists, and the local outlets, completely eviscerated. News outlets on these stations completely gone. As I was telling my students today, WVON used to have 15 journalists on staff. You would walk around and talk to people, what's the news in the community of the day, what's going on, so that it was also a source of education about issues that wouldn't make the national news, obviously, and that wouldn't even necessarily make the city's broader news, but that was a very big deal in Brooklyn, in Baltimore, in the south side of Chicago, et cetera. And so what happens is you have a massive expansion of outlets but a contraction of control over them and a limited set of narratives that come out of that. Because the profit margin always has to be greater when you're looking at large numbers. You need more people to pay attention. You can have a niche sub-market, but your overall market has to be propelled by large numbers. So what ends up happening is this triangle of the politics of racial ideas, the synergy of the way hip-hop becomes the kind of fodder for this trinity of a narrow scope, the expansion of mass media, and then the weird denial of the fact that these are racialized images being consumed in hip-hop become the norm of what we're dealing with. So, for example, African Americans very upset with Macklemore winning a whole lot of hip-hop awards. People want to say, well, why? I don't actually mind. I'm of a different mind about that because I think the whole Grammy thing is just a complete loss. So I'm like, got to decide where to get worked up. But it sounds like racism, right? They just don't want whites, winning awards in their genre. It's everybody's music. So we have a colorblind response to a structural condition that produces a set of circumstances in which black artists have consistently been losing in the category of the work they've created. They don't win in the rock category. They don't win in the country category. I mean, they don't win in non-black genres. So then the question is, well, how does that happen? And what's the answer in a colorblind society? I don't know. So the consumption of the audience around these ideas has a dramatic impact. And what's really sort of shocking about the process by which it happens is that there's what would normally offset this kind of environment, just to use the visual again, the expansion and the narrowing and the sort of top-down use of these images. What would normally disrupt that would be an educational impulse. Right? If we learn incorrect things about the history of film or about the history of the Civil War, you go to school and you learn something about it, enough so that you get a chance to kind of counter it, or that sends you to another tier of books or another tier of articles or newspapers or archives. But what's happened at the same time is that the idea of teaching people about black culture has been deeply under assault. At the college level, it's not even present at the high school level. So, for example, there have been laws intended to outlaw ethnic studies in Arizona. It itself is, you ready for this? Segregation studies. It foments lack of harmony. So what we have is we're educating a whole generation of every background about nothing related to race, while we at the same time sort of overwhelm them with a very narrow set of images that rely on a weird and distorted combination of racialized sociological stereotype and highly aesthetic developed performances that normalize a structural condition put in the form of an art. But we don't have a language to actually unpack it. Now, at the same time, as I say that, which has certainly got to be a little bit depressing, there is good news, which is that artists are both being victimized and they're the way out. So at the same time as this is happening, you have amazing artists in every genre who are working like crazy to cultivate alternative spaces. And this is really the answer. You think about even Dave Chappelle. His whole Dave Chappelle show was a dramatic, critical satire on colorblindness. I mean, it's just, almost every skit really is this fascinating thing. Of course, some people misread him, and that speaks to this problem of how do you get heard. But he's just a brilliant example of it. But then I think of people like Lupe Fiasco and Janelle Monáe, J. Cole and others, who are really working in their music to challenge these ideas at the same time as they participate in it. And so I'm not suggesting that there aren't amazing artists doing great things, but they're hard to see for what they're doing because our chops are so limited on seeing why that matters so much. So it's really, if we're really going to understand black culture in a colorblind nation, we have to imagine that colorblindness is part of our future if we play our cards right. But it's not part of our present, and colorblindness doesn't mean not being able to appreciate the gifts of black culture and all it's given the world. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm really hoping to have a good conversation. My favorite thing is Q&A. Literally, well, all right, I like sleeping more, but it's my second favorite thing. No, I do. This is really where I have the most fun, is really trying to learn and understand what made sense and what didn't, and what I can further explain or learn from you guys. I learn from every single talk from you. Yes, ma'am. How are you?
My name is Samina Hadi. I'm a faculty member here in School of Ed. And thanks. My research looks at immigrant kids, and when they come into this country, they're coming into a black-white country. And there's a great book called Hip Hop Desi's. I don't know if you've ever read it.
No, yes, I have. I forgot her.
Desi
It's
is the term
Sharwa?
that-
What's her last name?
Sharma.
Sharma.
So Desi is a term that Indians used to refer to themselves, and her argument is that when Indian kids get here, they're the Indian kids who identify with black culture, and then they're Indian kids who identify with white culture. So I'm looking at research, looking at Latino immigrant kids and where they fit into that, and I'm wondering if you're looking at that argument of what happens when immigrant kids come into a black-white nation.
Yeah, wow, it's a really big deal. Well, first of all, black kids come in as immigrants too, and they also get constructed. You know, we often imagine that they're already black, but they don't necessarily understand themselves the way American race relation requires. So African immigrants from all over the continent, you know, Caribbean immigrants from predominantly black states, you know, just are like confused by African Americans and by race in America. But to speak to, you know, Indian immigrants, to speak to Asian American immigrants, there's a lot of Latino, a variety of racial backgrounds, which is a little bit more distinct. That polarization is played out insofar as the cultural associations become the symbol of the black-white divide. So that's why you have those who are sort of into hip-hop, right, or not, in some cities. Now, I will say this is a regional distinction, right? The West Coast, I don't think, has this problem to the same degree, because although the West Coast has these same racial structures, it's got more racial, multiracial diversity. So you have whole hip hop scenes, for example, that don't have any black people in it, multiracial. And that changes the way one receives it. But I think my general sense is that we have to figure out how to first of all, to break down the black-white binary in the first place, but not to break it down by pretending we don't see it, but by unpacking its roots and the value that it provides to those who have power and resources. What does the black-white binary do to generate privileges and disadvantages? That's the question I want to ask. And then I think we have a better chance if we can figure that out fully. I mean, I have my own speculations, but you know, people need to really study that fully. And then we say to ourselves, okay, in this era, the black-white binary is being retained and reproduced in indirect ways, right? Color-blindness, black hip-hop consumption, right? And social structural segregation. That's really the black-white binary in material terms. That it's being used to actually thwart the kinds of integration, the kinds of diversity initiatives that we're often hoping will happen. So the first thing is to acknowledge that the black-white binary is not just a kind of grassroots investment, it's a structural investment that generates an absolute form of difference. So my personal take, does that help answer your question? That investment is the key to that? Or did you want to follow up? No, they are, to my mind. First of all, Latinos can be black, white, brown, or, you know, Latino is not a color. The color hierarchy and the color divide in American society is significant. Dark-skinned Latinos, dark-skinned and black Latinos from the Dominican Republic, from Cuba, from Brazil, from a variety of places, have to grapple with racial hierarchy in Spanish. You know, it's not like it's gone. People have all of these nations have color-coded hierarchies. There's almost no one in the modern world that hasn't, in a sense, been infected by this. So that doesn't mean that it's the same as blackness, it just means that they're operating simultaneously. Same thing's true for Indian populations, dark-skinned Indians versus light-skinned Indians. Look at Bollywood, you know, it's a color hierarchy of aesthetics. Who's beautiful in Bollywood? Right? So, you know, I think that question of black-white not being a racial matter so much, because we know there's no biological proof of this, but a cultural construction that benefits those on the lighter end of that scale is in no way dismantled. It's just not even close. So to say we're colorblind is really to be blind to the privileges that society has afforded people. So I would say all immigrant groups are being forced into a strange kind of divide that we have to be honest about what work that divide is doing so we can reject it from the ground up. But right now, it is generally, I think, a significant top-down phenomenon that is not acknowledged as such. Does that get at it? Okay. I'm happy to take a follow-up if not. Okay. Thank you. That's a great question. I really appreciate it. And I love that book. And I've never met the author, so if you know her, tell her I think it's a great book. Yes, we have a gentleman over here in a gray t-shirt, I think. He doesn't.
As you see,
Nice.
the American culture has taken a lot from black culture and incorporated their music in many ways, like you have them say blah blah blah, and they basically are using what came from the African American Foundation. Do you think white people in the future are going to be taking more African American culture, more stuff that and it's going to increase, or do you think finally African Americans are going to break through and say this is our culture, this is our meaning, and
Oh.
you think they will finally be acknowledged finally? Do you think we're finally going to combat it, or is this just going
Going to keep going. Okay. Yeah. Well, see, here's the thing. I think that all different ethnic and racial groups and class groups and gendered groups and orientation groups contribute to society both as individuals and as members of the groups that they come from. So we all contribute to things. Like I contribute in my profession based on myself as just being an individual who's a little obsessive about ideas, and I found a career where that works. And then there's all kinds of things that my experience as a woman and as a light-skinned black woman, those things matter, have taught me that influence my work, and I bring that into what I do, right? So the same thing's true here. Large groups of people, whether they're black, brown, green, or yellow, contribute to American culture, right? The problem is not the sharing of the culture. Again, didn't we talk about this today? The problem is not the sharing of the culture. The problem is what's the terms of that exchange. The exchange is profoundly uneven. Native American culture is deeply manipulated, misunderstood, unrepresented, disparaged, and marginalized, and then mocked through sports icons, right? It's not that it's bad that people want to celebrate Indian traditions. They don't but they're not celebrating Indian traditions, right? It's a kind of minoritizing appropriation. So what I'm saying is what will change it is not so much only what African Americans do or what Native Americans do or whatever the group is or even what whites do, but it's whether or not we're going to choose to be educated about the politics of imagery and consumptions and validate the traditions that these things come from. So knowing, for example, when I teach hip hop, it's probably the hardest thing for me to teach for a lot of reasons, but one of the things that makes it so hard is that I have to spend like 6 weeks convincing people that it is the outcome of black diasporic culture. I didn't say other people lots of people have contributed to it, right? So you see what I mean? I'm not limiting it and separating it, but all of its principles, the cipher, the use of rhyme, the notion of the collage, the notion of sampling, these are principles that exist in every other musical genre in Black American culture, let alone Caribbean culture, and yet hip-hop is some random, completely dropped from Mars tradition that everybody just thinks they generationally invented. Who benefits from that incredible ahistorical understanding? Do we teach anything that way? Would you go into somebody's poetry class and we say, no, we don't know if that's British 19th century. We're just going to drop a rhyme on you from, Coleridge. No, we need to know where he's from, what traditions he's borrowing. You see what I'm getting at? So the illiteracy is manufactured, and that produces the very tension that you're asking when you say, who's going to stand up and stop it, right? What really stops it is a fundamental deep respect for the culture and the traditions and the recognition of inequality as the conditions under which that culture came into existence. It's my motto, but I guess that's self-serving, isn't it? But I don't mean college education. Junior high, not just black, just all cultural traditions, but I'm all for preschool. I really think it's hugely important because the illiteracy that people come to the subject with becomes a source of defensiveness later. Because you have to change their entire conception of what was going on, and they're offended because their whole notion of pleasure is attached to things that's been cultivated all this time. You feel like you're taking like candy from a baby. It's like, No, that's not the hip hop you think it is. Come here, honey. Just give that to me. Just relax, right? I'm just gonna, it's okay. I mean, that's what I feel like I'm doing. And then I'm like, okay, now we got hip hop in neutral territory. Just relax, take a nap, come back tomorrow, and let's talk about it. Because there's like this, you know, deep, deep connection that's built on such confusion. So for me, that answer is really everything about, are we gonna really truly engage with not just saying black people are entertaining and misunderstanding the traditions that they've built over centuries, but really appreciate the richness of that and share it on equal ground and on equal footing with the proper level of appreciation, just like I want to share everybody else's, right? I mean, it's not supposed to be a segregated cultural universe. Who wants that? 2 thumbs down. Does that answer your question? It's a really, I appreciate that question and the spirit within which you offered it. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Oh, some of it was pretty good, though. That In the Closet series, I don't know. I got caught up. I'm like, I'm coming. I'll be there in a minute. Can we move that meeting? Okay, but look, here's the thing. We discussed this in class, too. African American culture and black diaspora culture often privileges the notion of treatment, the notion of creating through a mode of difference a kind of repetition. In other words, you take fragments, or think collage work, right? You take ideas from elsewhere, and what makes it creative and innovative is not that you invented it from whole cloth, but that you crafted something entirely new and unique in the way you did what you did. So for African American culture, because it's about treatment very often and aesthetic, stylistic approaches, all materials are fair game. Right? So it's not that he picked an opera, because he didn't just do an opera, he did something entirely different. He did a black cultural version that used operatic principles, just like black artists have used kung fu, you know, stylistic principles in music. Like jazz artists took pop standards of the day and melded them into highly abstract bebop songs for fragments of a moment. Like an interview with Grandmaster Caz recently was saying that he was listening to Simon and Garfunkel when he was writing hip hop. I mean, nobody would believe that, but it's true. Right? So it's not that you're saying, oh, I'm in a black universe and I'm just doing everything, you know, only if it's not this way, I can't listen to it. It's more about the world is filled with sound and rhythm and motion, and I hear these things through a set of traditions. How can I bring them into my space in a way that makes me excited? George Clinton, we just were reading this week about funk in my class, about the Funkadelics. I was telling them that all that time, it never occurred to me that the delics part was related to psychedelic drugs. What was I thinking? Clearly, I didn't get it out enough. I was not hip. I thought it was like Funkadelics. I don't know. I just didn't put it together. That's right. Good point. I think I'm just a little too young for that. That's what happened. When he was hot, I was too young for psychedelic drugs. Phew, thank the Lord I skipped that. I have a few brain cells right now, so I don't want to lose any more. But, you know, you see my point and there was a tremendous piano player, I forgot his first name, Barry Worrell, who was a classically trained jazz piano player who put all that operatic sound in Flashlight and in, if you all know Parliament Funkadelics, in One Nation Under a Groove. There are all these operatic phrases in there that he brought in there, not because he's trying to imitate opera, but because he thought it would be an interesting sound that expanded the range of things that were heard. So it's not that these boundaries have to be fixed. We have to appreciate what and why and how the transgressions take place. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's another great. Wow, you guys are great. What else you got for me? More. Yes. Oh, how about 2, and I'll go faster. Okay. Yes, sir. Hi. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thanks for that. Well, okay, so the short answer is, I'm like, what's the short answer to that? I think we hold them proportionately responsible, not singularly responsible, because I think it really does matter what we elect to do. I mean, I could have come up here and given you an argument that, was very damaging to, I don't think my argument is, but I think others could be produced that'd be very damaging. I'm responsible for what I do. I take seriously the spirit of what I'm trying to do, which is to say, if we don't get this right, we're not going to solve the race problem that America has. The principles underneath this are not about the music. It's about the mode of exchange, the language of exchange, the politics of that exchange, and whether or not we have the moral and emotional and psychic will to actually make it different. Right? So that's why I do this. I don't do this just because it's about music. So the answer to your question is yes, we hold people responsible, but proportionately. And that is to say they are also deeply ensconced in a system that rewards only people who do that. When people say to me, we should just boycott Jay-Z, boycott fill in the blank, boycott fill in the blank, I say, well, what are you going to do? Just make space for another cat to pop into the category. So I can be frustrated with Jay-Z, or I can make an argument about what's wrong with certain narratives, no matter who the artist is, but I have to create an alternative cultivation of consciousness that makes that narrative unmarketable. So I'm still going to hold him responsible, though, for his choices, particularly after 50 million, or P. Diddy after 400 million, or however much millions. At a certain point, it's time to, to step away from the gangster pimp ho trinity. I mean, you got enough money, right? What's the drive? Then you want to hold the industries exceptionally responsible, and you want to ask the fans some questions, particularly the grown ones. Teenagers, I give a pass till they have a few classes. Then I start holding them a lot more accountable. But you see what I mean? It's proportionate. It's not just about the artist. They're part of the problem, but they're a victim of the problem. They're at the nexus of agency and victim. It's a very complicated space they're in. But you have to challenge them, and you have to do it in public so that the conversation advances, so that they're held accountable to answer to some of these things, because right now they're not. They're just behind the wall of corporate privilege, Does that answer? Okay, that's a great question. Yes, Gil.
That's a long-standing trajectory. I know this speaks to sort of black cultural production, whether it's film, whether it's art, or whatever. Like, who determines the images of black cultural production that are the selling?
Right.
You know what I mean? When Robert Townsend makes Hollywood Shuffle, that's about his struggles as a black actor. He was talking about that confusion that's created because you, as a black artist, want to have some sort of adherence to some sense of art, but the jobs that are available to black artists, the acting jobs that were available were the types of jobs that perpetuated particular stereotypes. So he makes this whole movie called Hollywood Shuffle, and it's about negotiating
That tension.
that tension.
Right. It's a great, hilarious film if you haven't seen it.
Because, and so it shows that, like, that exact question that you're asking, like, that's not unique to hip-hop, but that's a...
But here's the difference. Here's the difference. So yes, I agree with that whole analysis 100%. But there's one thing, why I went to the question of, say, P. Diddy or 50 Cent making 400 million, is that I do think there is a threshold after which your accountability raises up. Because if you're just a struggling artist and all you can do is play, which happened under, minstrelsy and happened under Hollywood films, the only role is a very derogatory, subordinated black person, but you want to work as an actor and your day job in real life would still also be subordinate, right? Then that's a different moment. But if you're looking at people with a 30-year career where they have just massive amounts of resources and power, and they're still participating in it, now you can't make this kind of analysis as I think legitimately. And I think at some point we have to say, okay, if 30 years in and $100 million in, you're still doing it, then you're buying into it. You're not just a victim of, I need to get a job, because you don't need a job with $100 million. I think I would live rather perfectly. I would be just terrific with 50 million. So if anyone's giving it away, I'm happy to give out my address. But let me tell you what matters though. Chappelle had this right, and I think it does require some courage, and it requires values that are beyond money and participation. And what he said specifically about his departure from his comedy series was that he was supposed to be a teacher. His mother's actually a college professor, and he was supposed to be a teacher, high school teacher when he grew up, and he didn't want to be a comedian. And his father said, well, look, as long as you can make more than whatever the teacher's salary of the day was, you're good, right? It's gravy. It's on top of what you would otherwise make. But he said, but the kind of field you're going into, He said, just remember that there's a price to the ticket. And you got to remember what your price is. Right? And you got to decide it now when there's nothing to lure you away. What's your price? And you got to stick to it. And when the price gets too high, you got to get out. And that's the metaphor of the costs of your integrity, the costs of your values, the cost of your love for people, the cost for speaking the truth in the prophetic tradition. When that gets too high, you have to get out. And I think that's how we should all think about this. It's not 100% or zero. It's about how far are you going to go and when is it too much? And when do you have to make another choice?
And I think that that's Robert Townsend's point in Hollywood Shuffle. Even when you are the struggling black artist and those are the only opportunities available to you, like that impetus is still on you to still be, like you're not relieved of responsibility.
No, you're not relieved of it, right.
So even if you
So it's proportionate responsibility. Right, it's proportionate, right, exactly. And I think that's true of all of us. Those of us with more money, more power, more education, more privilege, more access, more microphones have a greater responsibility in my mind. I mean, we all have a lot, but we have a greater responsibility to try to do our best. We can't, to me, you can't afford to, it's not only just squandering it, it's irresponsible. There's too much suffering in the world. And this is really why I was so honored to be asked to be a Lund-Gill visitor, because it just struck me that it was so much about figuring out how ideas and history and knowledge turn us into, ethically focused citizens, family members, colleagues in the spirit of a just world. This is very, Pollyanna sounding in this day and age, even though it's exactly why I do what I do. So I thought, gee, how cool that they think I fit this. But then I thought, how much cooler that they're doing it at all. And so, this is not a small thing. The schools don't go around having, basically justice teachers, you know what I mean? This is amazing and wonderful, and I hope you appreciate it. I certainly do. Last question from our alumnus, whose name I can't remember. I just met you. Marilyn, I'm sorry. Remember everything about you but your name. Sorry, hon. Everything you told me, not everything about you.
I have thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. I want to tell you my husband is a former producer for Tupac Shakur, actually in New York, so I've heard him lament so many times the originality of hip-hop in New York and how what they started off hoping for with their music and what it is today. And now I'm a teacher in middle school, and I'm seeing, put aside the color-blindness, the new racism that I see every day, but the real tragedy of the situation is that there are so many students, young people, whole generation who see the hip-hop of today as black culture. They see
That's
that
it.
as their identity.
Yep.
And so as I teach and try to, elevate their understanding of, well, that's not black culture. That is a very minute.
It's not even just hip-hop.
Yes. What they see
I know,
in media.
and they see it all the time, remember?
Exactly. How do you?
It's my symbol.
How do you elevate? How do you change that? I have a Mexican-American student who wrote in her research piece that African-American culture is full of gangs, murder, and violence. And I'm editing it, and I'm just like, what do I...
Yeah, from her point of, or his or her point of view, that is in fact probably true. Right? Because what's black culture? It's mass-mediated narratives that are based on these structural stereotypes. That's exactly the condition that this essay is trying to address. What do we do to help see this from an academic perspective to theorize it so that we can have a strategy to make that unhappen? But your choice to be a teacher is the answer to this, insofar as it's not just teaching subjects in the abstract, but getting our schools to teach African American culture. Once you know African American culture, or even to teach the politics of racial imagery. Some of the books we've been reading in our honors seminar. We have students that are not specialists in African American culture, and they're in the honors seminar with me, which I'm grateful for. But I've had a number of comments, a number of you are here, so you can tell me if I'm making this up, but they'll be like, I had no idea this was going on. I never saw this before. I didn't realize this was what was the context. And that's because there's no real systemic knowledge base that's provided on the subject. And so what we're left to is to be sort of just heads with the top open being filled with these really troubling representations, whether they're the nightly news, which disproportionately shows black people as criminal and never shows them doing anything good, positive, or valuable, that in the cultural realm, whether it's in the political arena, or the like, or the curriculum, where you do modern poetry and there's not a, person of color on it. This is very common in our overall national educational system. So I think that gets resolved by saying that black culture matters. If it matters enough to be constantly on the airwaves and constantly in the theaters and constantly attached to consumption, then it matters enough to educate people about all of its history. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you guys coming out. I really do. Thank you. Thank you so much, hon. Appreciate it. Have a good night.